Okay, so the topic that I decided to explore for this assignment was food etiquette in the Philippines. More specifically, I was interested in exploring the history and evolution of etiquette in the Philippines and how etiquette has shifted over the years into what it is now and is today. Um, so I chose this topic because I knew I wanted to research some aspect of food, the history or evolution in the Philippines, whether it was the evolution of etiquette, comparing certain foods and traditions and aspects of Filipino food culture to those of Western society, such as the United States, or looking into food that's around certain holidays and festive activities in the Philippines. I knew that I wanted to study some aspect of Filipino culture. So I chose this topic because I grew up eating Filipino food in my hometown, and I wanted to explore its foundation and historic culture. My hometown of Chula Vista has a very large Filipino demographic, and I was always drawn to it. And now that I'm in this class, I have the chance to explore its foundation. Um, so food in the Philippines is actually greatly influenced by its geography and location. When thinking about the geography of the Philippines, it's important to highlight the fact that there are actually over 7,000 islands that comprise the Philippines. That's an astounding statistic that shouldn't be brushed over. Um, because of that, because there are over 7,000 islands in the Philippines, seafood is the main dish that is consumed along with rice. As it relates to today's world, though, climate change has actually had a very negative impact on fishing. Um, This has made it much more difficult for fishermen to make a living and pull fish from the ocean. The shift in climate change has had very negative effects on the economy and the access that people have to fish and just food in general. Um, the Philippines have a very rich history when it comes to food and dining and etiquette. Um, it's important to start by pointing out how heavily the Philippines are influenced by its surrounding countries and nations. Dating back to 3,400 or 3,400 BC, rice has been a staple in Filipino cuisine as it was brought to the Philippines during an Indo-Malaysian, Chinese, and Vietnamese wave of migration that occurred during 3,400 BC. Um, then, as the Philippines solidified trade with China, things like soy sauce, fish sauce, and even methods of cooking such as stir frying were introduced to the Philippines. Um, this fact is really important because this eventually led to the creation of very popular dishes such as pancit and lumpia, which are two dishes that are very, very popular in the Philippines today and throughout the whole entire world nowadays. Um, the Philippines also traded with and were heavily influenced by other places such as India, Malaysia, and also Indonesia. Um, but of all, um, probably the Spanish probably had the biggest influence on Filipino cuisine and etiquette. With the arrival of the Spanish came the arrival of things like utensils, and before this, Filipinos ate with their hands. Utensils were introduced by the Spanish to actually end what was considered to be barbaric and sort of uncivilized ways of consuming food. So the Philippines were introduced to utensils such as knives and forks to use for eating. This style of eating is important to highlight as the etiquette in the Philippines has evolved even more and shifted even more to move past the use of knives at the dining table. So before this, the traditional way of eating in the Philippines is called kamayan. So here it is right here. That's these pictures right here show two different kamayan feasts or two different kamayan meals. So in Tagalog, which is the native language of the Philippines, this word translates directly into the word hands. Um, just like it sounds, the style of eating involved using your hands to eat food that is laid out on a bed of banana leaves. So in those two pictures, you can see a bed of banana leaves and the food just laid out on top of it. This is a very community-based way of eating that actually builds trust and symbolizes intimacy amongst all the people who are sharing a meal. Um, Initially, this style of etiquette was created in the military as Filipino soldiers rushed to eat on their way to complete their daily tasks and whatever they had to do. Um, there are really several basic guidelines to combined dinner that should be followed, and I've listed them here. So the first, you should always have clean hands. That kind of goes unsaid and doesn't really need much explaining. So the first step of a combined feast is to have clean hands and make sure that you're sanitary. Um, that's the first rule of etiquette in a combined feast. Then you should use your right hand when picking up and eating the food. So you should scoop and then place it with your thumb. Um, you shouldn't, I mean, so you should keep your left hand down by your side while you're eating. You shouldn't really use your left hand for anything while eating because it's actually considered to be the unclean hand. So yeah, your left hand should be down, and then your right hand should be the one that's eating. Um, you should use your thumb to push the food into your mouth. Um, traditionally, combined meals were very social. Oh, sorry. Traditionally, combined meals were very social events and feasts that marked social gatherings, holidays, family things, kind of like family get-togethers, and just important social gatherings that took place in the Philippines. Um, with the arrival of the Spanish came the arrival of utensils like forks and knives. Which was important to note because knives aren't even used anymore. Um, the shift was made from combined to a new modern way of using utensils because the Spanish actually viewed eating with your hands as barbaric and uncivilized and unsanitary. And as we shift into more modern times, etiquette in the Philippines has evolved even more. So we can go ahead and take a look at that. Um, now, forks and spoons are used to eat. Um, Many people eat with the fork in their left hand and the spoon in their right hand. They'll use the spoon to actually scoop the food. Actually, let me go on to the next slide. I'm sorry, this one just talks about Spanish colonization and how they came in the 16th century. But now I'm talking about more modern forms of etiquette. Sorry. But people actually eat with the fork in their left hand and a spoon in their right hand. And the spoon is actually used to scoop the food. Um, so yeah, the no more knives at the dinner table. It's evolved to spoons and forks. Um, there are some cases though where no utensils are used, but usually utensils are used for that. So in the Philippines, meals are a very social experience, and people are expected to eat a lot. You know, after you're finished eating, you're expected to eat more. It is actually recommended to leave some food left over on your plate if you decided that you don't want to eat anymore and you decided that you're too full. You should actually just leave food on your plate as a sign. Um, Also, the head of the table is reserved for the most honored person. The most honorable person at the table is always at the head of the table. Um, and the host should always be the first person to be served. It's not the guests who are invited, it's the host or the hostess. Um, when you're eating in a Filipino household, you'll actually be directed where to sit. So you'll be told where to sit, and that spot is where you should stay for the whole entire meal. Um, it's actually a great honor to be invited to a Filipino household for a meal, and one should be delighted to receive an invitation. But it's also important to remember that in many middle class Filipino households, servants are used, so they most likely prepared the food. Um, Along with this, you shouldn't wander around the house. You should stay exactly where you're told to be seated by the host. Um, Otherwise, unless you're told to, unless you're told that you're allowed to wander, otherwise the rest of the house is usually off limits. That's just a common thing in Filipino etiquette. Um, it's always recommended that if it is a serve yourself sort of meal, which isn't usually the case, that you should wait for the host or the hostess to begin. You should never be the first to serve yourself. Um, the same rule also applies to drinking when you're in a Filipino household or in a restaurant. Um, More specifically, when you're in a restaurant and you would like a refill or you would like seconds or just help from your server or waitress, you should make eye contact to get their attention. It's actually considered in Filipino etiquette disrespectful to wave for their attention. Yeah, you should make eye contact. Usually at the end of the meal, leftovers are offered to be taken home in a small bag. In a Filipino household, they'll use a goodie bag to give you their leftover foods to take home. At first, they say that you should attempt to refuse it, and then you should finally accept it, gladly accept the food and take it home. Along with this, it's respectful to not take the last bit of food from the plate. Instead, it should be left over for whoever chooses to eat it or take it. Um, when invited to a meal, it's also typical and usually respectful to show up somewhat late. Filipino people, or in Filipino etiquette, it's common to show up 15 to 30 minutes late. I know on my slide it says 15 to 20, but actually it's up to like 30 minutes that people actually show up late in Filipino etiquette. Um, and by the end of the meal, to finish the meal, most people will use a toothpick. And when they use the toothpick, they'll actually use one hand for the toothpick, and then they'll use one hand to um to cover their mouth and use it as sort of a shield. In a restaurant, usually the person who does the inviting and invites the guests is the person who pays for the meal, unless it is already specified um, before the meal or before the guests are invited. Unless it's specified that's going to be split, then it's always the host that is splitting it. And it is never a woman unless she's a foreign visitor or a foreign businesswoman traveling. Um, So in all, the Philippines have a very, very rich food history. And by diving into the etiquette, I've realized how much etiquette has evolved from the Philippines. It's evolved from eating with your hands and being a very, very social gathering to now kind of reflecting Western standards. And now utensils have been introduced, although knives are not necessarily used, forks and spoons are used, and food is still a very, very social endeavor that is celebrated and held to a very high standard by people in the Philippines.